All right, let's go ahead and get started. We are looking at Romans from an exegetical standpoint. We're going to go over a quick review. I know some of you were on vacation stuff last week when we started this. The reason I started this, for those of you who don't know, and put 1 John on pause is because I've been having some discussions and some debates, if you will, in Mexico on Romans, and so I've been doing a lot of work in there, so I figured it would be more fair to everybody if we just talked about what I'm actually reading and thinking about than trying to juggle different things. So that's why we're looking at Romans. We're going to quickly go over what we saw last week, just a few points that I think you would need to know to kind of be up to speed with how we're looking at the book of Romans. So let's look at that. So we're calling it an exegetical study, and so if you don't know what is an exegesis, that's a strange little word. You may not know what that means, but that's what an exegesis is. It is a detailed examination of the elements and structure of the text for the purpose of understanding its intended meaning and proper applications. So that's what it means whenever you, that's what it's supposed to mean. Now, that if you get into listening to more mainstream Christianity, not small fundamentalist groups like ourselves, but more mainstream Christianity, you're going to hear that word a lot. It's used a lot. It's generally used as being in opposition to what's called proof texting. Proof texting is where you go find a verse that says what you're trying to say, and that's your proof, right? You have a text, and it's your proof. And it doesn't matter if it's completely out of context. It just matters that it says what you're trying to say, and you can kind of finagle what you're saying to make it more fit better, that text. And so exegesis is the desire to get away from that and to look at the text, what we would call in context, might be how you have probably have heard it if you have not heard about this or this word or the use of it. Now the problem is exegesis many times is mixed up with interpretation, and they're not the same thing. It's very, very important to make that distinction. We must interpret the Bible. Anyone who says they don't interpret the Bible either isn't reading the Bible, or they're deceived, or they're lying. You cannot not interpret it, okay? Because the Bible is written with very vivid imagery, very robust figures of speech. For instance, metaphors. If I were to use a metaphor and say, my love is like a rose, you would have to interpret what I'm saying. You cannot take that at what we might call face value, because it doesn't mean anything at that value. Well, the Bible has a lot of metaphors in it, a lot of allegories. For instance, the parables, right? Jesus wasn't actually saying that the Word of God is an actual technical seed, right? That's a metaphor. And so in order to understand what he says in the parable of the seed and the sower, you have to interpret it. You have to. And the Bible's written this way. And not just the parables. Paul makes extensive use of metaphors throughout his epistles. And so if you're not going to interpret it, you're not going to understand it. Now, we've gone through this before, but it's very important to understand. So I'm not against interpreting the Bible, but exegesis is not interpretation. Now, it's important to make those distinctions. Where do you start? You start with exegesis. Exegesis is about trying to understand what the author intended for you to understand, how he intended it to be read. So when you look at a passage of the text and you say, hey, this is a parable, this is allegorical or metaphorical, well, then you are applying exegesis. You're not saying what it means, you're just identifying the type of literature you are reading and how it's meant to be understood. Then you will take that form of looking at it and you will start to interpret the text and say, okay, if it's metaphorical, then what do these components mean? What do the elements of this metaphorical story, what do they mean? And that then becomes interpretation. But you can't properly interpret the text unless you do a proper exegesis of the text, where you look at the text and say, okay, what is the argument? How is he developing the argument? How is he writing this down? How is he trying to get me to understand this? And so you look at it like that. So it's important to distinguish these from interpretation. So that's exegesis. Now there's a flip side, or there's an opposing view or opposing method that is more predominantly used than exegesis, and it's called eisegesis. Eisegesis. It's the process of interpreting text in such a way as to introduce one's own presuppositions, agendas, and biases. It is commonly referred to as reading into the text. So eisegesis looks a lot like exegesis in some ways, but what you do in eisegesis is, and this is you may not know the word, but you'll know it when you see it, right? It's where you take a text and you read into it what you want it to say. So you just go find a text and you have a preconceived idea. You have a preconceived doctrine, and you find a text and you just read it into it. This text means I'm right. That's called eisegesis. I gave an example last week. I'll show it to you. So this would be an example, all right, a visual example of what we could call exegesis, right, where you take something the way it is, you try to figure out the way it actually is and what the components are and how it's made up. So you take, like, for instance, a body or an animal, and you look at all the bones, and it's what's there, right? You're digging. You might dissect a dog and find out what's there. Right? So that would be a way of looking at exegesis. And this would be a way of looking at eisegesis. And we've all done this, where you look up at the clouds and you see animals. Now, those clouds did not order themselves to look like animals. You just see in the clouds what you want to see. And like I said last week, probably everybody on earth has done this. Looked up at the clouds and seen animals. But no new species has ever been discovered by looking at clouds. Why? Because you see in clouds what you expect to see. You can't see something you're not aware of. This is the problem with eisegesis when you look at the scriptural text. Many people people that do this can look at any text in the Bible and see anything they want to see. But that you will never see what you're not expecting to see. Which means you are constantly limited to what you already know. Now, if what you already know is true, and it's broad, well, then it's not terrible. And that's why I think most preaching I hear is exegetical. But it's not terrible because they're starting from a foundation where they're generally true in what they believe. And they generally have a broad orthodox base of belief. And so, they see good things. They see salvation by grace. But that's all they see. And it's all they will ever see. Because they're not looking at the text saying, what does the text read to me? They're looking at the text saying, what can I read into the text? And this is why exegesis is important. This is where you start off and say, I am not trying to find anything in here. I'm not even trying to understand what it means. I just want to figure out how it's written, how it's put together, and what the arguments are. And then I'll go from there to start understanding what those arguments are. But that's kind of what exegesis is. Now, so to do this, and this is the only point we're going to look at from last week, and then we're going to move on. We had a lot of points, but this is the most important one. And that is, to do exegesis, you must read the text normally. Normally. You cannot have the idea that the Bible is a magical, mystical book written in magical, mystical language and does not conform itself to human grammar. You cannot look at it this way. So I know we had my mother-in-law read this last week. We'll have somebody, Jackie, you weren't here last week, right? Okay, so I'm going to ask you to read what I'm going to put up on the screen, okay? Just read it out loud to us. All right, go ahead. Okay, so that is how almost all of your Bibles are formatted. And when you look at that, that is difficult to read. Now, if we were to put it in a paragraph format, it's the exact same words, same punctuation, far easier to read than it was the other way. Right? And that's what I mean by reading it normally. It's starting from the point of text where you actually, if you're going to read a Bible that has verse numberings, then you're going to have to learn to look past them. If not, your mind has been trained from the time you were taught to read to identify line breaks as paragraphs. So you're going to look at it that way. But then you also need to start looking at what the grammar is and how the punctuation is. And the punctuation is supplied by the translators to help you understand the grammar. where the parentheses are, where the subordinate clauses are. All that's very important. You cannot overlook that. And if you will listen to many sermons, you'll find that many times they just preach something like randomly in the middle of a sentence because it's the verse. You know, when I was younger, I was much more concerned when I would like make tracts or publications and I was going to put verses in, the text of verses. I was always much more concerned that I get the whole verse. Like, okay, well, this really doesn't go with what I'm saying, but I got to put it in because it's the verse. And not at all concerned with whether or not it was the sentence. So I'd pick up mid-sentence, that's fine, or even split two sentences, that's fine, as long as we get the whole verse in. Verse numberings are arbitrary. They're very useful, but they're arbitrary, and they will not help you with exegesis. They have no value whatsoever in understanding the structure of the text. Paul did not divide his epistles. As far as we know, there's no evidence that he divided his epistles either in chapters or in verses. No evidence of this at all. There's very few portions of the Bible that we can say, like Proverbs was divided into these little sayings, but most of them are not. They are narrative form or they're prose form, and they were not divided this way. It will not help you knowing what verse is where in the chapter, book, chapter, verse type knowledge. That is not going to help you in exegesis. If you want to understand the text, you're going to have to look at the text normally. So that's what we talked about last week. So this week, before we get into talking about Romans, we're going to talk about what I'm calling the literal understanding versus what I would call the technical, because there's not a good word for this that I can find. Maybe one of you will know one, but we're going to use this terminology. So we have a tendency in English to use literal wrong, right? I literally, right? You see, I always say this. They literally, you know, whatever. And generally, it's misused, okay? It's completely opposite of what it actually means. Now, look, I'm not a word Nazi. I really am not. I point these things out because if we're going to have a serious or meaningful discussion like this in this type of an environment, then we're going to have to agree on some vocabulary, and words are going to have a certain meaning, at least in this context. So it isn't that I think you should stop using the word literally wrong. I don't care. But while we discuss literature, I think it's important that we have a word that stands for what literal actually means. Now, it could be a different word. And I've tried that. Look, I've tried different ways of approaching this. And so a lot of times I'll say the literary meaning. That's not really a word, and it doesn't really mean that. But I do that because when I say the literal meaning, people say, well, you can't take the Bible literally. Well, how else can you take it? It is literature. There is no other way to read the Bible but literally. Literally does not mean that everything in there is technical. Okay? So when Jesus says, you are my sheep, you say, well, that's not literal. Well, of course it's literal. It must be taken literally. It doesn't mean you are a physical sheep. That's not the literal understanding. Literally understanding the text is identifying that he is using a simile. He is using a figure of speech. The literal understanding of the text in that case would be the proper one. Right? So we say, well, that's not literal. I'm not a bat. Well, maybe you are, but no, right? You would say, well, that's not no, that is the literal meaning. And what you're talking about is that is not, and I'm just using this word, it's not the technical meaning, okay? So think about the difference between reading a work of fiction and reading a manual for a microwave. Manuals for microwaves and TVs, technical manuals, they don't have figures of speech. They don't say, take the bolt that is as long as your arm and throw it into that hole that's as small as your pinky. That's not how they speak. They'll give you, right, take the 3-inch bolt that's a 1/4 inch by 20 thread and put it into the 3rd hole down from the right and tighten it righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, right? They're going to give you technical terminology, no figures of speech. When you read anything that is not technical, well, then you have what we might call literal in the sense, in that it is going to be full of figures of speech, allegories, metaphors, similes. There's going to be hyperbole. There's going to be all kinds. And there are hundreds of types of figures of speech. And most of them are used in the Bible. It's surprising how lively the biblical language really is when you start looking at it this way. It's full of these things, and it is meant to be taken literally, meaning to discern what form of literature it is written as and be understood in that way, okay? And so we have to distinguish. I want to give you just an example of a difference between what is literal and what I'm calling technical. Now, literal, this is the actual literal way that we should take this. Technical, I'm just using the word for lack of a better one. Okay, so here's a literal understanding. So Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 13, though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Now, the literal understanding of this is charity is the essence of all meaning. That would be a literal understanding, right? You say, well, Paul doesn't literally mean give my body. No, he actually literally means that, not technically, okay? The technical way of doing that would be we're commanded to sell all we have to feed the poor and to burn our bodies up. When we're done giving everything away, we should light ourselves on fire. That would be taking that technically. Taking it literally is understanding that he is using what's called hyperbole. Right? Hyperbole is where you exaggerate for effect. Now you think, well, why would anybody do that? Well, 2 verses up, that's verse 3 that we read. 2 verses up, same paragraph. It's all the same one. There's not verses, so in the same paragraph, this is how he starts out. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. Now, taking that technically, we would say there are tongues of angels that we should all speak. Now, that's not the literal understanding of this text. That would be a technical understanding. And if Paul was writing a manual, that's how you would understand that, which is how Pentecostal churches take that verse. Because they are not taking it literally. You understand? Now, we can use whatever words we want to make this. Literal is probably be easier if we call literal the misunderstanding and call it the textual or literary, the proper, whatever. The improper understanding of text is to take this, which is an obvious hyperbole, and turn it into what we would call the literal. I don't know. It gets real confusing, but you understand what I'm saying. That's what we're talking about. And you have to be able to identify this and make these distinctions if you want to understand the Bible. How do we know this is hyperbole? Well, several ways, and you can look this up and stuff, but for instance, Paul actually, if you look at it in Greek, he actually uses that word often in his text, hyperbole. Hyper this, hyper that. He uses the word hyper a lot. It doesn't translate into English as much, but it does, and it uses it. Why? Because he's saying, look, I'm exaggerating. We can also, the main way you find hyperbole is you look at the context. And what is the context? The context is he has 3 clauses in which he gives you an extreme example to make the point. If I speak with tongues of angels, if I can move mountains, if I give my body to be burned. Not only does he use hyperbole, but he uses it in a very beautiful way in which each one grows to the point where at the end, see, this is why you have to read in context, at the end you realize that this is hyperbole. Because he starts off with something, you're like, And then he says, and if I can move mountains, you're like, well, And then he says, and if I give my body to be burned. Because he's growing. This is a work of art that he's writing. What the meaning, what the value of charity is, that it is the essence of meaning in life. You have to have charity. And so it's like a crescendo. It grows and grows until he gets to the most extreme possible way of expressing this. At no point in time is he saying that Christians should give their bodies to be burned. That's not the point. So, anyway, this is besides what we're studying, but this is what you have to understand when you're going to do any meaningful exegesis. You must look at the text literally, or as literature, right? You must look at the text as literature, and you have to identify how it's written, and not think that they came up with some. This was actually believed. See, before they discovered very many manuscripts of the New Testament, they actually thought that the Greek that was written in was heavenly language, devised by the Holy Spirit and the authors only for writing the New Testament. That's what was believed by most scholars at one point in time. Well, then they started finding manuscripts, not just of the New Testament, shopping lists and wills, and they found out that this Greek was not exclusive to the New Testament. Everybody spoke it, and everybody wrote in it, especially the more common people. And then we find out that the words and expressions and forms of speech that we find in the New Testament, particularly in the writings of Paul, are very vulgar. Not vulgar in the sense of cussing, vulgar in the sense of not elevated, not elitist. Very common, which is what vulgar means, right? It's common. It was the street language of the time. That's what Paul wrote in. This very educated man wrote in common street language. And so they didn't invent a literary form. They used the ones they had because they meant to be understood. You're not going to be understood if you're inventing your own literary forms. You have to use the ones that are already in existence. So that's what they did. And so you have to read the Bible with that idea that you're looking at it as something that you can understand from a literary point of view. You do not need, right, a decoder ring to understand the structure of the text. Right. You can just look at it normally and understand it. Okay. So let's talk about Romans. We're going to call it Romans Road. I think this is interesting. So most of you have probably heard of the Romans Road, and it's referring to, right, a salvation message that pretty much spans through Romans, where they go to like Romans 3:23, Romans 6:23, and you go through these verses, right? Romans 10:9, and it's like you're sin results in death. Jesus died for you. Romans 5, and then Romans 10, if you'll confess with your heart, you'll be saved. And it's called the Romans Road. And that's not what I'm talking about, but I like the term. And it's actually, I know they didn't intend it this way, but it's actually very interesting because, in my opinion, this is actually how Romans is written. It is written like a travel log, a philosophical travel log, where he's going to go through with you, the author and the reader. You're the reader, Paul's the author, and you are going to travel with him as if it was his first time through these concepts. And you're going to discover them with him, as if no one had ever seen them before, because that's how it's written. And we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at it that way. And I think you'll see it when you start looking. You'll see that's exactly what it is. The way he starts, he doesn't start with these broad theses and then go back and try to prove them in reverse, right? Deductively, it would be called. See, that would be deductively, where you would say, okay, here are the theses of Romans, and he'd establish those in chapter 1, and then throughout the book of Romans, he would, in reverse, try to prove those points, right? And that's how most preaching is done. It's done deductively. They tell you, today, I'm going to tell you 4 reasons why sin is bad, and then number 1, number 2, number 3, that's deductively, right? Romans isn't written deductively. It is written what we would call inductively. You don't know exactly where he's going with all this. And as far as you can perceive, either does he. Now, you know he does, right, because he's writing it. But it's written as his first, as if it were his first time looking at these things. And so you find all the emotion of discovery in the writing. He's answering questions that would arise at the moment, but he doesn't put them all together. It's as they come, as he goes through these ideas and these concepts, questions come up, and he takes them and says, what about this question? Well, this. And then he goes off on that. And it's like you are with him. Every reader gets to walk with Paul as if it was his first time, Paul's first time, looking at it. So we could call it a Romans Road. And so I know that's not what they meant when they coined the term Romans Road, but it fits as to how it's written. Now, this is why it's very important to understand this. You cannot understand Romans well if you are looking at it to jump off at the first train station you get to. You have to consider that what you find in 1 is not the final idea that he's trying to explain. Right. This was just the first leg of the journey. You got to think of it as that when you study Romans, you get on a train with him, and he starts pointing out, you don't know where you're going, and you don't know what you're going to end up at, but he's saying, hey, look at that, and consider this. And the train starts coming to different forks in the road. It could go one or two ways, and you don't know which way, and apparently it seems like he doesn't know which way, and yet at the last moment he says, hey, let's take a right here. Well, if every time you get to a point where there is a decision like that, and you decide, hey, I'm going to disembark from the journey, and I'm just going to camp right here. This is going to be my proof text for life. You are not understanding Romans. That's not how it's written. You have to go all the way to the end, because what he explains at the beginning is not necessarily the final form of what he's trying to teach you. It is how he's getting to that final form. It is the induction into that. How many of you, and this is important to understand, so what do you see there? Do you see a vase? Or do you see two faces? Well, it depends how you look at it. You actually can't see both at the same time. It depends how you look at it. That's called negative space, right? So you have positive space where you see what's there, and you have negative space where you see what isn't there. And it creates two very different images in your mind. Romans has a lot of this employed, and that's one of the literary mechanisms he uses in Romans to do this. He not only tells you what is, but he deals with what is not. So we find these in the questions and the diatribes that come up. For instance, one of the examples would be where Paul says, so should we sin that grace may abound? Okay? That's a question he asks. And then he answers the question right away. He says, God forbid. Or let it not be so. Or heavens no. I mean, there's a lot of ways to translate that. But basically saying, no, absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying. Okay, but that's the positive space of it. The negative space of that question is, why did that question arise? Now, this is critical, and we're not going to get into the details, but I just want you to have this in your mind as in the future weeks we start going through Romans like this. I want you to have in your mind that this is critical to understanding Romans properly. Because he does not go in detail into the negative space of these questions and say, this question arose because, and then go through and explain it. He just answers the question very simply, no, and he moves on. But the question tells us something. The fact that the question is asked is very meaningful. It reveals something that the text itself does not reveal, by implication. So it's extremely important. There's a lot of these, more than any other place in the Bible. There are a lot of what we call diatribes, or they're called, or what you might call a rhetorical question. There's many of them, and they're critical to understanding what Paul is trying to say. All right. Now we're not going to get into what they are as we approach them, because this is a problem, right? I think this is a problem with people trying to understand Romans. They just go in, they just jump in the middle of the journey. It's not meant to be taken that way. We must start at the beginning. And we must walk with him through it. But as we do, I just want you to be aware that many times he's going to point something out and say, hey, what about this? And he's going to say, no, that's not good. And what he intends for you to do is say, there's a reason that question is asked. Right? And so any doctrine that comes out of Romans has to accommodate that negative space that was left there. It's like when you have a mold and you have a positive and a negative side, right? If you want to cast a part in plastic, they'll have this metal mold that has the shape of it in negative, and they put it together, they pour it in, pour the plastic in, and when they pop it apart, right, then you have what's there. Well, you can look at either the piece or the mold and figure out what it is. But you're looking at it from different ways. Paul's taken these questions and he's puts them together, and he's saying, look at the question and think about any doctrine that comes out of Romans must fit the questions. They must fit the questions. I have heard doctrines taught out of Romans that do not fit the questions. That doctrine would never cause that question to arise. That's the negative space in Romans. Right? It's the opposite of the formula. It's like the division to the multiplication. It's the way you can test to see if your interpretation is accurate. Because if it's accurate, then that would be the question that would naturally arise from it. But if it's not accurate, then the question would be meaningless. It would never be asked. Very critical. And this is why he constantly does. There's a lot of them. A lot of this. So that's important to look at. Okay. So Romans, I've only done 1 through 8 on this. We're going to obviously look through more, but I just wanted to start with this part because this is the main movement of Romans, at least in my mind. And I've summarized there, and I've kept the chapter divisions. I don't think that they're exactly precise, but they're really close. Really close. I mean, the people who did chapter divisions in the Bible, I think they did a really good job. I really do. I think the ones who did verse divisions did a good job. And they're very useful. I don't want you to think that somehow, like I'm snobbish towards them. They did amazing. It was an amazing thing they did, okay? And the chapter divisions, they're really good. They're not meant to be used this way, but they work. So we're going to keep them this way. All right, so chapter 1, we could summarize chapter 1 as being the descent into paganism. This is mankind has been created. Everything's good. So he starts off, if I want you to just try to visualize this as a journey. You are traveling with Paul. The journey starts on day 2. Man has been created. Everything's in existence. I guess it'd be day 8, but anyways, you understand. After the creation of everything, man's created, woman is there, man has named the animals, and they've sinned, and I think they basically sinned immediately. I don't think they lasted a day. Literally. And technically. And so they've sinned immediately, but right now, it's right when they've sinned. He's picked up the story right then. But we're not looking at it in individuals. He's not talking about Adam. He's not talking about Eve. We're looking at it from far away. We're standing up and we're looking way down, and it's like the scene comes up, and mankind is descending into paganism. They knew God. Everybody knew God. A lot of times we think of knowing God as being like the Jews knew God. But you realize that for a long time, everybody knew God. Abraham's interaction with Abimelech and with everybody else around there that weren't Jews, they all knew God. They feared God. They had visions of God. You have Abraham coming back from having liberated Lot and Sodom, and here comes this Melchizedek out of nowhere, and he's a priest of God, and he's not of the lineage of Abraham. Well, you don't know. In fact, it says that, literally speaking, right, he is without father or mother, meaning there is no literary record of his genealogy. We don't know where he's from. He just comes out of nowhere. Now, I believe he was an actual real person. I do not think he's pre-incarnate Christ. I know some do. I don't. I think he was just a real, literal priest. I think they were all over the place. They were all the way up in the time of Jesus when the Magi came down. The wise men came down at the birth of Christ. People that knew God. So knowledge of God was not reserved, was not only to the Jews. This idea that the Jews have knowledge because God supernaturally gave it to them is not true. What he's pointing out in chapter 1 is that everybody knew God. And they threw that away. It wasn't that God created some people in darkness and other people in light. Everybody was in light. But they threw that away. And they descended into paganism. And it wasn't because they didn't know. It's because they refused to know. They would not have God in their knowledge, it says. They didn't want to know. And they didn't want to be governed. And they didn't want God to be their Lord or their king. And so, what did they do? They worshiped and served the creature instead of the Creator. They knew it was a creature because they created it. They went down to the forest and they cut down a tree. They used part of the tree to cook food. They used part of the tree to make a table and a chair to eat the food at. And then the other part of the tree, they carved it into a little figurine. And then they said, "It's my father." That's what the Bible teaches. That was the descent into paganism. And then in chapter 2, we have the ascent into hypocrisy of the Jewish people, who had the Word of God, and instead of holding it in integrity, they became extremely hypocritical. You're having trouble with that one. They became extremely hypocritical, judging all the other people, all the Gentiles, for the laws they didn't keep when they themselves were not keeping the spirit of the law that they were given. They accused the Gentiles of the idolatry that we spoke of, but they were sacrilegious, which is a much more nuanced form of idolatry, right? Yeah, they had all the law, and they kept the law to the letter of the law, and they were like, well, we don't have images, but we're covetous. We don't kill, but we hate our brothers to death. So they ascended into hypocrisy. And then in chapter 3, he deals with the inadequacy of the law to address these things. The law was inadequate to address both the paganism of the Gentiles or the hypocrisy of the Jews. All it could do was point out the problem, but it offered no solution. And that's what he deals with in chapter 3. In chapter 4, he deals with the primacy of faith. Faith is first and foremost. Now, this is very important to understand, and I mean this to be taken very technically in this point. When we say faith is first, it means that there was faith before there was law. That's right. Critical to understand. Before there was law, there was faith. This is what Paul says. If you look at dispensational outlines of history, I'm not a dispensationalist. And one of my main issues, or one of them is, one of the main issues I have with dispensationalism is that they have the idea that the church is the parentheses. That you have God working mainly with the Jewish people, and then the church comes, and the church is gone, and then he starts up again with the Jewish people. And that's kind of how dispensationalism is laid out, at least traditionally. And I take certain issue with that. I don't find this to be the case in the Scriptures. The church is not the parentheses. The law is the parentheses. This is what Paul teaches in Galatians. The law was given 430 years after the promise. And he's speaking of the promise in a very specific form because that promise was actually given all the way back in the Garden of Eden. And he clarifies that it even antecedes the Garden of Eden, and that promise was made in the eternal mind of God. God's promise of salvation by grace, not of works, that is history. Israel in the law is a parenthesis. That's what Galatians teaches. You just cannot take and read Galatians exegetically and not come up to that conclusion. Because that's what it says. It was given 430 years after the promise, and it ended when Christ came. The law was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, but we are no longer under a schoolmaster. So we have a definite period of time in which the law and Israel and Judaism were valid. Now, this is a problem with dispensation. I think they invert that. I think they get that around backwards. At least some of them do. So I have an issue with that. So this is what we mean by the primacy of faith. Faith is first, and it's foremost. This is one of the things. It's interesting. Romans is often looked at as one of the triad books of Paul dealing with the law, or of the New Testament if you don't think Paul wrote Hebrews. But there's three general books, right, that we think of as dealing with the issues of the law. Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. But Romans actually mentions the law very little. It's really surprising. Very, very little. He talks about the law in chapter 3, and he ends chapter 3 saying, so then do we discard the law? Do you just get rid of it? No, in no wise. Yea, we establish the law. And you would think, okay, he's going to go on and talk about that. No, doesn't mention it again. All the way down to like chapter 7. It just disappears. Because again, it's that one of those diatribes I was telling you about. He doesn't intend to address it. The question itself is the point, not the answer. The question is the point. The question reveals more than the answer would reveal. But he doesn't mention it. So it's interesting in Romans. We think of Romans as, right, the book that dealt with the law, and yet it deals very little with the law because faith is foremost. He deals with faith. He deals with grace. That's what he deals with. Again, Romans has a lot to do with negative space. What does it tell us about the law? For instance, just think for a second. I know I said I wasn't going to do this, but I just can't resist. Right? What does that question tell us? when he's dealing so little with the law, why would the question arise, so should we get rid of the law? Why would that question come up? If everything he was saying was not leading a normal thinking human being to ask that question. Because it's not asked as a question that is like, oh, I never thought about asking that. It's a diatribe. It's asked as if it were the question that everybody is thinking. Paul is putting a voice to everybody's thoughts. Because you've done that, right? I mean, this is how, you know, I have to mention you. This is how Terry and I have conversations. And I know it. I can see it in her eyes. So we'll be talking, and I'll say something, and I can just see in her eyes she's not listening anymore. Because she is thinking how stupid I am because of what I just said. And I can just see the gears turning. I mean, they are moving. It's like a mighty locomotive up there. And I could talk then, you know, for an hour, and she wouldn't hear a word I said. Because she's thinking of all her objections. Well, we all do that. You're listening right now, and some of you right now have objections to what I'm saying. They're in your mind. You're not nearly as mysterious as you think you are. And Paul is saying, yeah, I'm talking about grace, and right now, you're not hearing grace. You're thinking, whoa, wait a minute. You're saying we're going to throw the law out. No, that's not what I'm saying, but let's move on. Incredible how he deals with this. This is what you'll find if you just start reading the text normally. This is not some, like, you know, super spiritual insight. This is what if you would just say, hey, okay, the Bible was not written by God, it's not Word of God, it's just a book. I'm just going to read it like a book. I think you'd actually understand it better. Now, I'm not saying that it's not the Word of God. I'm saying that God wrote it so you could understand it that way. And I think that is far more impressive than this digging in. They're like, we're going to dig down, and they get down, they say, well, if we look at every fourth word of every second verse, and we compare that to what, and they get all this crazy stuff, and I'm thinking, you are throwing out the gold, and you're digging for dirt. Just read it the way it is, I implore you. You can always go back to the decoder rings. Just read it. Anyways, chapter 5 is the gift of righteousness. He talks about how righteousness is a gift itself. Righteousness itself is a gift. Very important to understand that he makes a distinction between the law of righteousness and righteousness itself. You understand, and we've dealt with this many, many times, and I'm just going to keep emphasizing it because I know that many people, they don't either agree with it or they just don't get it. So I'm going to emphasize it again. The law is not righteousness. You understand this. I'm not talking about the law of Moses. I'm talking about any law. Any law whatsoever. It is not righteousness. It is meta-righteousness. In other words, it is a description of righteousness. Righteousness itself is far too big to actually inhabit a law. A law simply describes a piece of righteousness. Very important to understand. And so how do we become righteous? If we can't describe it fully, completely, if we can't contain it in a tablet of stone or in a book of vellum or wherever that is or in a computer database, then how can we have righteousness? Well, chapter 5. Righteousness is a gift. Righteousness itself. And so those of us who have righteousness, we don't attain to the law of righteousness, he says, but to righteousness itself. Very important distinction. And then chapter 6, he deals with the liberty of death, being free from death. Chapter 7, he deals with the bondage of sin, what that looks like. And then chapter 8, the life of the Spirit. And that's kind of how he develops this. And so what I've done here is that we've stood at the shore or at the pulling away station of the train that's going to go down into these long valleys and up these mountains. And what we've looked at are the high points of this journey. Now, I've kind of given away, right, the journey. It's not, you should try to just forget that this week and sit down with the book of Romans and read it like a travelogue. You and Paul are traveling through a philosophical landscape. And he is pointing out these truths to you. these theological truths along the way. And saying that road, that may be the one to take, but no, we're going to go this way. And I know this doesn't look like it makes sense, but we're going to take a left here. I think let's take a left. Let's see where this goes. You're not following him like he's a guide saying, I know where I'm going. That's not how it's written. It's him saying, what do you think? Should we go this way? I think we should go this way. Let's check it out. Let's see what happens if we make a left. Let's see what happens if we press forward here. Let's ignore that and let's just move on past that. Let's not go down that road. And let's see what happens. It's a fascinating way to write. And I think it's a fascinating way to read it. So try that this week, all right? All right, so we're going to quickly get to here what the thesis is, because he does have a thesis. It's not exactly a thesis in that it's not a deductive sermon or deductive thing, but he does have a starting point. He starts off. Where are we starting off at? Well, this is where we're starting off at. We're starting off with this verse, or this sentence. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Such a simple statement, but it's a very powerful statement. Paul had every reason to be ashamed of the gospel. You know, we think of that and we're like, well, we wouldn't be ashamed of the gospel. Paul had every reason to be ashamed of the gospel. The gospel stood against everything he had ever believed. It had caused him incredible amount of problems. Yes, pain, physical pain, emotional pain. I mean, every type of, the gospel, if you looked at Paul's life and you'd say, Paul, was the gospel worth it? And this is what he's writing. This is how he starts off. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And the reason why he writes Romans is to explain that. How could Paul not be ashamed of the gospel? I think any one of us would be ashamed of the gospel. I think many of us have been ashamed of the gospel. For a lot less than what he was, right? But you can't just be like stubborn about it. You can't just say, well, I'm just not going to be ashamed of the gospel. I'm just not going to do it. That's just being stubborn. Peter, in a related topic, right, in his epistle, he says that if we suffer as wrongdoers, we should be ashamed. Now, if we're not suffering as wrongdoers, then we should not be ashamed. And we should, be resilient and stand up to opposition and persecution. But we have to know. We have to know. Is the gospel which is bringing to us this persecution, this problems, is it real? Is it true? That's why Romans is written. Paul says that we need to talk about the gospel. There is every reason in the world to be ashamed of this message. Everybody hates it. The Gentiles don't like it. The Greeks don't like it. It's foolishness to them. And it's a stumbling block to the Jews. Nobody likes it. Nobody wants to hear it. Everybody's against it. They are going to persecute you. You're going to lose everybody you love and know. Your life is going to be rough. Are you ashamed of the gospel? Well, don't just say no. Because if the gospel's not true, if what you and I are calling the gospel is not true, then we should be ashamed. Why should we be telling or saying or preaching or teaching or believing something that's wrong and so divisive? We have to know. We can't just assume. We can't just be stubborn. We have to know. Is the gospel, the way we've understood it, is it true? Well, he says, let's take a walk then. Let me show you why I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Let's just start at the beginning and let's look at it. And at the end of the path, if you decide, you know what? I've walked it with you and I don't agree. I'm ashamed of that message. Well, then so be it. But maybe you get to the end of Romans, the Romans road, and you get out with Paul and you say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel either. That is the power of God. So we're going to stop there because we've run out of time, but we'll pick that up next time I teach.